Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we're continuing on with our series with former biblical Unitarian, now general theist, I think, right? General theist of a sort, Dr. David Kemball-Cook. Hey there, David. How's it going?
It's going well, thank you, Dale.
Excellent.
I had a tooth out yesterday, though, so I'm a little bit. I may not speak very clearly.
Oh, okay, so you're drugged. It'll be easy to defeat you for.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the anesthetic has gone to my brain.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we can bring you all the way back to Christianity then.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the other guests, we were supposed to have David Russell joining us, but he's a no-show. So hopefully, maybe he'll join later on in the show or something. But we'll continue on because we do have a couple topics just between you and me to go over. But just before we get into those topics, I'm kind of curious to get from you when we started this series with you. It was kind of a main goal to try and bring you back to faith in Christ and that sort of thing, right? Because you had a number of objections, and I wanted to give you reasons to come back. I'm just kind of curious now. It's been over a year since we started that. Do you find that the series is helping contribute to that goal, or at this point, do you feel you're kind of entrenched in your new position?
No, well, I never feel that I'm entrenched. I always try to live up to your definition of a real seeker. Let's have a look at it. Sincerely open-minded to the truth, actively seeking the truth to the best of their ability, and willing to obey, follow, and or submit to the truth about such matters upon discovery. That's right, isn't it? That's what you...
Yep. That's a real seeker. Yep. It looks like he exited the studio, but hopefully he'll join back in a minute. But yeah, just so the audience knows what we have planned today for the agenda. We're going to go over, last time I spoke to David, we went over the evidence for the empty tomb. I gave 5 lines of, in my opinion, cumulatively speaking, conclusive evidence that the empty tomb is a fact of history. And so David's going to be kind of coming back on that. And he's had time to do the research and read some of the papers that I cited and stuff. So hopefully, okay, he's back.
I'm sorry, Dale. I accidentally closed the window, I think. But
no problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so no, I think I live up to your definition. And doing these series of shows with you has been really interesting. I don't think I've moved out of my skepticism of Christianity, but I've been learning a lot along the way. I think our discussions on your use of mathematics, of Bayes' theorem, and your Bayesish formula have been very interesting, and so have got me thinking. And so I went back to the article by the McGrews, which we've talked about resurrection. I looked at went through the cosmological argument quite well, reading your long paper on that, and then went to the chapter in the Blackwell Companion by Alex Proust, which is again very interesting. And I'm a fan of the cosmological argument, or at least one version of it, and so that was also very interesting. But that's not an argument for Christianity. That's an argument for theism, and I'm persuaded as to the truth of some form of theism. So it's all been very interesting, and dialoguing with you and the other people as well, and Tyler and David, has all been very good. But the dial has not been moved on Christianity, and one of the main problems I have is that ancient documents, I don't see how ancient documents give us enough evidence for a miracle, a long time ago, 2,000 years ago. And that's why it's a shame that David is not here, because that's what he said in one of our previous shows, is that they do. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about today.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully he'll join again by the time we get to that. If he doesn't, I'll give my best shot at what maybe he meant by that. But fundamentally, there are two approaches with the historicity of using ancient documents, right? So that I think what David meant when he said that comment, I'm just guessing, is he was saying, well, we can trust in the historicity of the resurrection because we can prove the ancient documents are historically reliable, generally speaking, and therefore we should believe its reports of the resurrection and empty tomb or whatever it is, and crucifixion and that. The approach I've been taking with you, though, is more of like Gary Habermas, a minimal facts or a moderate facts type approach, where I'm applying the secular criteria of authenticity to the ancient documents. I'm not assuming they're reliable or inerrant or anything like that, but I'm saying as a historian, we can still prove certain facts. And last we agreed, kind of thing between you and me, that Jesus' crucifixion is a fact, so we didn't need to debate that. But last time we went over the empty tomb. Is that using the criteria of authenticity? Can we prove that that is a historical fact? And that's where I gave my case. I'll just kind of quickly, I won't go over the presentation again, but I'll quickly summarize just for the audience who may not have heard that show what my 5 lines of arguments were. Okay, so I'm sharing that. But boom, are you guys seeing that?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
So these are the slides that I gave presented to David Kemball-Cook, right? So I presented 2 lines of archaeological proof: the Nazareth Decree inscription, as well as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. According to most archaeologists, not even Christian ones, they agree that this is probably the authentic site of Jesus's empty tomb. And I presented the case from Joan Taylor, who was actually initially a skeptical person, but she said from her archaeological excavations of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they can show that it actually matches the biblical description of the garden. So she says that the site of the empty tomb is here at the Z. Y is the traditional site, and then X, this is the actual site of the crucifixion, according to Taylor, Dr. Taylor, and this Z is the actual site of the empty tomb. And this just happens to fit the location as described in the Gospels in terms of the Golgotha being a topos or a region. It's not a specific point on a hill or something like that. Tradition's got that wrong. Right outside an old gate. And by the year 40 AD, this received an entire makeover so that it would have been impossible or virtually impossible for later Christians, in the 300s, during the time of Constantine, or whenever else, late first century, whenever you want to say it, in 135 AD, when they set up the Venus Temple, and I'll just show that. This is what it looked like from 150 to 325 AD. It would have been impossible from this to tell and get it just correct where the empty tomb would have been, and have that match the description as presented in the Gospels, where it represents tradition obviously going back earlier than 40 AD, before the emperor remade Jerusalem and that sort of thing. So that was that first argument, the 2 archaeological arguments. The other arguments I gave was based on the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, where the specific word, I think it's thaptos, proves Jesus was buried in an actual tomb. He wasn't just thrown in a common pit or a grave, a hole in the wall, a hole in the ground or something like that. And I provided Dr. James Ware, famous biblical scholar, wrote a peer-reviewed journal proving that this is the case. And I believe David has read that article now. And then finally, I gave N.T. Wright's sufficiency argument that, look, it's an absolute proof that the earliest Christians taught and believed in Jesus's resurrection. That would be impossible unless 2 conditions were met. They had appearances of some kind, whatever those appearances are, we'll get into in a later podcast, and there was an empty tomb. If you had an empty tomb but no appearances, no resurrection belief. If you had appearances but no empty tomb, no resurrection belief. And that was N.T. Wright's sufficiency argument. And finally, I gave the classic criterion of embarrassment, which is saying that women, Mary Magdalene and a group of women, were the first witnesses, not just of the empty tomb, but even more importantly, we can add another fact here, the appearance to the women, that Jesus first in his resurrection state appeared to the women. That is highly embarrassing in a first century context, and no one in their right mind would make that up if it wasn't true. The only reason that's reported is because it's probably, very probably true. So that was my argument in a nutshell for the empty tomb, the 5 lines of evidence I presented. Yeah, David, so I'm kind of eager to turn it over to you now that you've had some time to process these arguments. I know that you gave some counters in the show itself, but now that you've had some time to read some of the papers I sent and process these arguments, where do you stand now? Are you in the same place? Have you made modifications? What's your take on these evidence?
Yeah, I think I'm still in the same place, Dale, and I can see N.T. Wright's argument there, and in fact, you said to me or emailed me that that the disciple, there had to be an empty tomb. If I'm right, let's just see what exactly you said.
Yep. Oh, do you want me to bring up my slides again?
No, I've got it here. It would be near impossible for Peter and the 12 to teach a bodily resurrection if there was no empty tomb that they saw with their own eyes. That's what I think you said in an email after our last show. Yeah. And,
so go based on what I presented in the slides. That's more or less right, but just out of technicality, like N.T. Wright's argument is that in order to have resurrection belief, 2 things. You have to have appearances, whatever those appearances were, which they thought were the resurrected Christ, and an empty tomb. If you take away one of those things, no resurrection belief.
Yes, well, I don't know about that, because if we say, for instance, that there was a resurrection, there was an appearance or a vision of some kind to a woman or a group of women and to Peter, there could have then become, as it were, socialized or accepted amongst the 12 that there had been a bodily appearance of Jesus, and that kind of story could spring up over a fairly short length of time. And we know that people do have visions or encounters with people recently deceased. That's a commonplace occurrence, and so I think they call them grief-induced hallucinations, perhaps. But there could well have been this kind of experience with say Mary Magdalene, other women, Peter, and then a group of disciples, the 12, got together and believed that they had that kind of encounter with Jesus, and it wasn't necessarily a bodily resurrection at that time, but they didn't necessarily see Jesus eating fish or anything like that. But this kind of story could get around quite quickly, springing from these kind of grief-induced hallucinations. And so I'm asking myself here, what's more probable, that Jesus really was raised bodily from the dead, or that Peter and a few women had these kind of experiences, which then spread to the other disciples? And then I come to the conclusion that it's more probable, that's not certain, but it's more probable that these were these kind of illusions or grief-induced hallucinations, rather than a miracle. And the tomb story, we could have been brought in later on. We don't have a story about the tomb until the Gospel of Matthew was written, which would be at the earliest in the mid-50s, say. So that would be over 20 years after the event, and so the story there. So then I know you're going to come back to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, and we could talk about that one, but that would be the earliest mention that you might have of a tomb, which we talked about last time. But balancing them, and just looking at Hume's maxim, which we talked about, I think, late last year, or was it January this year, that we've got to weigh the evidence against the likelihood of a miracle, and the testimony, and we've got testimony that's 2,000 years old. So and weighing that against a miracle, which is the stronger. So that there was no miracle; it was just a natural phenomenon, or was there really a miracle? So I'm not moved on that, Dale. No, not yet. And I think all that the arguments for the validity of these old documents come back to treating them as basically historically reliable. And of course, if you accept that the gospel of resurrection accounts are basically reliable, you have a resurrection, of course. But that's the point there, And I think you would be assuming that the stories about the tomb and Joseph of Arimathea are reliable. Well, that's what I'm questioning.
Okay, so you said a couple things, a couple points you responded to. So let me start with the 1 Corinthians 15:4 thing, because you read James Ware's article, especially on this Greek word thapnos. And I think if I'm understanding what you told me in the emails and confirm here on the show, so you do concede that argument works, in that you believe there was a very early teaching of an empty tomb, whenever the creed dates from within 6 months to 3 years after the death of Jesus. You concede that there were Christians teaching this empty tomb, but you still say, but that doesn't prove there was an empty tomb. Is that
well? Yes, I mean, 1 Corinthians 4 does not say that there was a tomb. I'll read it in the King James, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. So there's no mention of a tomb, and actually nowhere in Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but nowhere in Paul is there a mention of a tomb or an empty tomb. Paul doesn't use that kind of argument, and I know that we talked about this as well last time, is that Paul is, in the same chapter, is actually distinguishing the resurrection of believers, of which Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits, from a bodily resurrection. He's saying it's a spiritual resurrection, or a spiritual body, not a natural body. Yep. And we did talk about that, so we could go back there. But Paul nowhere mentions or bodily resurrection or an empty tomb. We've just got this one verse here, verse 4. And a linguistic argument. I think you quoted, or was it who quoted Dale Allison on that?
I did.
You did, yeah.
It's impossible for this not to be speaking of a burial in a tomb,
yes.
Given the thapnos. Here it is. Given this thapnos word by Dale Allison right here. The verb used in am I showing my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I've got it as well here. Yeah.
The verb used, this thapnos, which is translated buried, would hardly be used of the unceremonious leaving of the body to rot on a cross, or dumping of a criminal in an unmarked trench as dog food. That would not be burial. Rather, it's denial.
Yeah.
This verbiage nor is the verbiage consistent with not knowing where the body was placed. And Gary Habermas goes into even more exquisite detail in his newest book on the Resurrection, Volume 1, where he talks about this word, and it's only consistent. Every use is only consistent with a proper funeral procedure in an actual burial tomb. It's inconsistent. It's actually linguistically impossible to be speaking of just dumping a body in a common pit. So those are the arguments there from Gary Habermas, and obviously James Ware gives his take on the verb for raised, which shows that there's this continuity. But that's more about bodily things, so I'll stay away from that for a second. But yeah, so like, what do you make? It seems like you're just ignoring this Greek word from thaptos, which
no, I'm not ignoring it, Dale. But I'm noting that Paul, if we're talking about Paul does not place any emphasis at all on a bodily resurrection or an empty tomb. Now, but if we're just looking here at 1 Corinthians 15:4, we say, well, that's early, but how early? We don't know how early it is. You've said within 6 months to 3 to 6 years after Jesus' death. So that's, if we said 6 years, say, then that's a long time for a myth to grow up.
Not really.
And I said to you last time that it does not take long for a myth to grow. Something that's not true to spread around. Now, even nowadays, I cited the example of the outcome of the last U.S. election, presidential election.
But that's not a myth, right?
Yeah,
myth, you have to distinguish a myth from what you're assuming is a lie, right? Again, I'm not.
So yeah, what I mean by myth, I'm using it in the sense of something that people believe, which is not true.
Sure, yeah. I mean, false reports can and do happen immediately, right? Like I can tell you right now, the sky's red. Okay, right now in 1 second, a myth, quote unquote myth came up, but that's not really applicable to what's going on, right? Because if you're going to go down the conspiracy route and say, well, the disciples were just lying, you've already denied that in previous shows.
No, I didn't say that, anything at all like that. No, I think there's genuine belief there, and I do accept that the early chapters of Acts were written by an author who was trying to write history of the early church. He was not present. It was not eyewitness accounts from him.
You're going too late. Right?
But he was writing it on the basis of reports that he'd had of how the early church grew. And so these witness to a belief in, we agreed, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. But the question is, are these true? And if the disciples genuinely believed in a bodily resurrection, then a story about a tomb could have grown up. And 20 years is even 6 years is
the max. Yeah.
Is plenty of time for these kind of myths to grow. Our problem is that we don't know exactly what, for instance, Peter told Paul. They don't tell us that. Even in 1 Corinthians, in this verse we're looking at, the second part of the verse talks about being raised according to the scriptures. Well, what scriptures are those? We don't know. That's something that you and I were talking about in response to the Messianic Prophecy show. Is that we're really a bit in the dark about what scriptures these are. We don't have enough information about what people believed at that time and how long it took for belief in an empty tomb to grow. If the Gospels could be dated to say weeks after the death of Jesus, then we'd be in a better position to know. But 20 plus years.
We have something that meant, you've admitted that 1 Corinthians is a creed that goes back, let's go 3 years, because that's the maximum that Garrett Ludeman gives, right? 6 months to 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so 3 years to help you out as a skeptic. Mm-hmm. So you've got 3 years to come up with. So after 3 years, you're saying that the disciples made up and invented a myth that Jesus was buried in the tomb and there was this empty tomb. That's what you're supposing happened, right?
I didn't say made up, did I?
Well, I mean, how else? Okay, like what happened? Explain to me how did the empty tomb myth come about 3 years
after? I'm not in a position to know how it came about. All we can do is hypothesize.
But it
Isn't
wasn't
it?
a deliberate. Okay, what do we know about the origins of this myth? It wasn't a deliberate lie of the disciple. Are you saying you would say
Well,
that?
I don't, you know, I personally, I don't think so. I think there was genuine belief there in resurrection, and I think that there were appearances uh, which which later grew into stories about bodily resurrection where Jesus could be touched and so on, and the story about a tomb got from somewhere, you know, and the writers of the Gospels might have been looking at Isaiah 53, where they got, you know, buried with the rich in his death, to get the story of Joseph of Arimathea. That these stories just kind of, without fabrication, these can just grow up. I mean,
Okay,
as a, I mean, we can look at.
I want to press on this a bit, right? Because I agree. Here's where I would agree with you, right? This is N.T. Wright's argument, right? It is impossible, right? If they had a belief in the empty tomb, you're kind of doing it in reverse order, right? That would entail, or sorry, if they had a belief in the resurrection, that would entail there was an empty tomb appearances. But the reverse is also true. So if we're saying 3 years afterwards, the disciples had a genuine belief in an burial and empty tomb, and you're saying, well, that derived from a prior belief in a resurrection. They believed there was a resurrection, right?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Prior to
you're saying what the disciples believed, but again, we don't know. I told you just now that we don't know. I claimed that we don't know what Peter actually said to Paul when they met. All we've got is this passage in 1 Corinthians 15.
Okay.
We
Okay.
don't know that all the disciples believed that. What you know, all we've got is to what the disciples believed post alleged resurrection are the early speeches in Acts, isn't it? That's, I think, is the evidence that we have.
Well,
I don't think we can use 1 Corinthians 15
we
as
can.
evidence for what the Bible, what the disciples believed. I mean, it looks like an early creed, but that doesn't mean that all the disciples signed up to it at all. We've got. How do we know what all the other disciples, apart from Peter and John? You know, the other disciples disappear from the pages of history, don't they? In the book of Acts.
Okay, so Paul met with Peter and James and John later on, but Peter and James for this in Galatians, right? And he tells us the context. What is he asking about? The gospel. What's the gospel? Bodily resurrection. So that's how we can clearly, no one, not even Bart Ehrman, would deny. We know the content of what Paul was talking about. Now, I will admit with you that we don't know specifics necessarily from that. Like, oh, well, did they discuss what color a burial shroud Jesus had, or you know, did someone have a nervous twitch or something when Jesus was first arrested? Right. We don't know that, but we do know that the content of what Paul was confirming in Jerusalem was the gospel. That's in full context in Galatians 1. And this is how he's confirming. How do I know my gospel? I'm not preaching a different gospel because, number one, I was an apostle. Jesus appeared right before me. And then I went to Jerusalem and confirmed that my message was on track with that. And that's why in 1 Corinthians he's saying, I'm delivering to you what I received, those the essential gospel. The essential gospel we know from all Christian, early and late, is including the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, that's where I was going to say.
Right. Yes. Okay, Dale. But I repeat my point that actually Paul's gospel, if we look elsewhere, in his letters, is not about bodily resurrection.
Okay.
And he never saw bodily resurrection. He never saw Jesus appeared to him so that he could be touched. He places no emphasis on that in this chapter 15. As I said, he distinguishes between the resurrection of the natural body and resurrection of the spiritual body. And he says Jesus is the first fruits of this latter resurrection, the spiritual body, not the natural body.
Okay, great. So this is where we're going to come into some new material, and I've done prepared a presentation for you because I promised you last time that we would get into this issue because all biblical scholars know that we can prove. Now that's an over an exaggeration. Let me put it this way: the vast majority of biblical scholars know that it is a bodily resurrection that Paul preaches. It's not a spiritual resurrection, and I'm going to try to prove that, right? But just before I do, one thing you mentioned earlier when you gave your initial thing, you said, well, maybe there were post-death communications and or grief hallucinations. For today's show, great, I'm going to grant that to you. You're still granting N.T. Wright's argument that there were appearances of some kind, and that was a necessary ingredient to get to belief in the resurrection. The other part is if it's belief in a bodily resurrection, you need the empty tomb. If it's belief in a spiritual resurrection, you don't need the empty tomb necessarily. I will admit that. But I'm going to argue that there's no such thing as a spiritual resurrection. That's a contradiction in terms. So let me bring up us. I have a few arguments here in this presentation. So, okay, so the first, as you read James Ware's argument. So you know that the verbiage there that's speaking, and this isn't unique to 1 Corinthians 15. All the New Testament writers, including Paul, talk about this, right? So that there's a bodily continuity. What dies? That's the exact same thing that rises back up, according to the Koine Greek that's being used. And Paul even gives the analogy in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 to 44, of the seed and the plant. So, and comes right before our creed there. So the seed is sown, buried, and then something different arises, the new resurrection body or the plant, to go with the analogy. So that this analogy presupposes continuity between the seed and the plant, in that, that which you sow is the same as that which is made alive. The seed is obviously analogous for the body. That dies, it gets buried, and then it's that same body that arises. So that's the first argument. And James Ware, you would have read James Ware's argument where he gets into this and explains the linguistic meaning of the verb raised, which prior to the present study has not received due consideration, is of decisive significance for the debate regarding the nature of Jesus' resurrection within the formula. And then he goes into the semantics of this verb. When used to denote resurrection, necessarily entails the restoration to life of the body of flesh and bones within the tomb. So that's argument number one, is there is this continuity. And given James Ware's argument there, it's a necessary continuity. You can't escape it. It's linguistically impossible, given that sociocultural context, to understand it as a spiritual resurrection. The second argument I give, so some skeptics, and I haven't asked you yet, but I'm assuming you're going to use 1 Corinthians against me and say, well, look, no, there is no continuity because it's a spiritual body that's raised as opposed to the natural body that dies. So Paul is differentiating. I heard you. Were you agreeing with that? Like that's one of the arguments you use? Or
oh yes, that's right. I mean that's what I've said a couple of times tonight and before as well. Is that Paul is making this point? Is that God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him? Verse 38. It's a seed, but it's not going to be the exact physical body that died. That's not going to be raised, and people are silly to think that. that's what Paul is saying here.
Okay, so here's my second argument to address that, because all biblical scholars admit you're misunderstanding. The term used for spiritual here is actually the same term Paul uses 24 times everywhere else in his writings. And these are never used in the sense that you are saying, and there's some immaterial, ethereal ghost floating around. No, it's always talking about spiritual in the sense of goodness, righteousness before God. So for example, Galatians 6:1, we are spiritually mature. It's about our privileged relationship to God. Right? 1 Corinthians 2:13, we have spiritual wisdom versus the foolishness of the world. Or Romans chapter 7, verse 14 says the law is spiritual. So by this word spiritual, it never means something ethereal or immaterial. And I note that there's one possible exception in Ephesians, but that's debated about. Let me just play a 5-minute clip by Mike Licona where he talks about this argument in his debate with, I think, Dale Martin, who, all right, is that showing up?
First of all, what was Paul's view of resurrection?
Can you hear that, David?
Yes, I can, yes.
And since whatever his view of it was, can be traced back to the apostles as well. What about, was he raised spiritually? Was he raised spiritually, not physically? And here, many scholars get 1 Corinthians 15 confused. He talks about how a body is sown a natural body and it's raised a spiritual body. The two Greek terms that are used there for natural is psychikos, from which we get the term psyche, soul, for psychology. The other word is pneumatikos, from which we get the word spirit. So it's natural or soulish versus spiritual. Now, what do those terms mean? Well, I did a study when I was doing my doctoral research, and I found, I think it was 846 occurrences of the term psychikos in the extant Greek literature from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century, 1100 years. And you want to know how many times that term meant something like physical, as the New Revised Standard Version, the Amplified Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, and a few other translations incorrectly render it. They render it as it's sown a physical body, raised a spiritual body. Well, those 846 occurrences, not a single one of them mean physical. Not a single one in the ancient literature. What about spiritual? Well, it could mean ethereal, like an immaterial body, as Dennis wants to interpret it seems. But it can also mean spiritual in a little different sense. Like, for example, in chapter 2 in 1 Corinthians 15, same letter, Paul says, the natural man, psychikos, doesn't understand the things of the spirit, for they are spiritually, pneumatikos, spiritually discerned. So he's not saying, contrasting the physical with the spiritual. He's saying people who are spiritually minded here. And in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, he's saying, look, the body that is sown, that's buried, is one that is natural insofar as it's animated by our typical organs, heart, kidneys, lungs, liver. But it's raised a spiritual body. It's one that's animated by the Holy Spirit. Why do we say this? Well, number one, Paul had some other terms he could have used if he was trying to compare physical with spiritual. He could have used sarkikos, which means physical, fleshly, okay? But he doesn't use that. And he had already used those two terms in 1 Corinthians 9, just a few chapters earlier. So he already had those and used them in that sense. Paul believes in physical resurrection because Romans 8:11, he said, the spirit that raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4:13-17, he says, look, I don't want you guys to grieve as those who have no hope. And then he talks about how Christ will bring back with him those who belong to Christ, the spirit of dead people who were followers and who were saved, who had already died as followers of Jesus. And he says, then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. How are they going to be raised if they're already coming back with him? Well, it's pretty simple. He's bringing back the spirits back with him, and then they're reunited with their corpses, which are then resurrected and transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. It's a physical body.
Okay, so I think you get the point. Do you want me to finish the clip, David, or?
Yeah, yes, if you could, yes.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Bodily resurrection. It's not spiritual in a sense that Jesus was seen as an immaterial being. Well, what about chapter 15 when Paul says flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, but yet Luke says in Luke 24, Jesus says, a spirit doesn't have flesh and bone as you see that I have. This is a confusion of terms. As Joachim Jeremiah said back, I think it was 1955, and he's not been refuted. And in fact, I looked up all the sources myself and found some additional ones. In all the ancient literature, whenever you see the term flesh and blood in ancient Jewish literature, it is always a Semitism that simply means the mortal body with all of its weaknesses. It's kind of like hey, he's a cold-blooded murderer. That is a figure of speech. It's an idiom. It's not saying that his blood, if you took the temperature, is below 98.6. Flesh and blood was a Semitism, a figure of speech. It did not literally mean something physical. Flesh and bone is not the same thing. So there's no contradiction there.
All right. So that's that linguistic argument there. And I just have a couple more, and then I'll finish and go back to you. But so the third argument is that Paul tells us in verse 44 that there are physical bodies for all. So I'm just kind of asking, what is the it that is sown a natural body and then it's raised a spiritual body? Well, what is that it? So this is kind of reinforcing that question that there is that continuity. And then my fourth argument is that, look, all the early Christian church fathers, they all agree about what spiritual means in 1 Corinthians 15 here, that it's, and they don't deny the physical bodily resurrection of Christ. Obviously, they come after the gospel writers and stuff, so that's not the strongest argument, but it is reinforcement supporting evidence that none of the church fathers, I mean, if there were these competing traditions, and again, I think with David, you can maybe avoid this because you're positing that there was this bodily resurrection myth within 3 years after, so maybe it just totally took over the church or something within a couple decades or something like that. But if it didn't, this argument is kind of, if you're saying what was the gospel writers who invented the myth of the empty tomb and stuff, well, that isn't enough time for the competing traditions of it would be spiritual resurrection versus bodily resurrection. And I think by the time of Ignatius, we would have at least some early church fathers talking about, the controversy raging between these two groups. But I don't think that counter works against David, depending on what he posits, because he's positing bodily resurrection myth within 3 years. And then I don't know if you would say that maybe it completely took over within a couple decades. But those are my four arguments, arguing that it's not an ethereal, ghostly resurrection. It is a physical, bodily, and in the biblical sense, spiritual resurrection. So over to you there, David.
Okay, so what are you saying, Dale? Is it that are you arguing just about Paul's beliefs, or what the belief of the early church was in, say, the 30s AD? Which is it, or both of them?
So both, right? So first of all, I'm arguing about Paul, and then through the connection, since Paul says my gospel is completely the same as Peter and James and the Jerusalem disciples, that means they also taught the bodily resurrection as part of their gospel because it has to match. Paul wouldn't knowingly contradict them, stuff like that. So it's both, yes. Yes.
Well, we are lacking evidence, aren't we? As I said to you, Paul talks about, when Paul talks about his gospel, he as I said, he doesn't mention a bodily resurrection. What he's talking about is salvation by faith, isn't it? Most of the time, there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither man nor woman. That's what he would say is his gospel. That's what the biblical record says. And I mean, I think you're putting words in his mouth, really. As I said, we don't know what Peter and Acts claims, or Paul claims that the disciples agreed with him. Okay, that's his story. Yeah, but we also know that there were sharp disagreements between Paul and the Jerusalem church at times. At least we know that from the evidence of Acts, and also Galatians as well. So you're kind of putting stuff in, filling in the gaps, as it were, with claims that aren't actually there in the texts.
Well, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, Paul's gospel includes the death and resurrection, and he explicitly says this. I mean, that's the point of 1 Corinthians 15. That's the only thing he's highlighting there is the essential gospel message. And he even says, look, if this isn't true and you don't believe this, you're dead in your sins. That's the gospel. It means you're going to hell. The gospel is to deliver us from damnation. So
yes.
death and
Yeah. I will agree. I will agree. Certainly in 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking here about the resurrection of the dead. And I would agree with you that the spiritual body does not mean necessarily ethereal. I mean, it may that it may have a natural element to it, but Paul's but Paul is actually arguing against it being the very same body, like, being risen. In other words, an empty tomb. He contrasts them, doesn't he? In
Yeah.
this chapter.
Yeah.
He ridicules people who say, "Oh, what body will it be?" Now, if he was going to say the bodily resurrection has to be the very same body, it's got to get out of that, get out of the grave, and all those sinews and be put together again, the bones healed and everything. Then that would be one thing. But he's denying that explicitly. So yeah, I agree. When he talks about the resurrection, there's going to be some kind of physical body. It looks like, according to him, but he said, it's not going to be the same body. Actually, the same atoms, if you like, and indeed, Licona rather put his foot in it, I think, in that clip, because he's saying, according to Paul, that when at the end, the resurrection of the dead, the spirits will come down back into those natural bodies. Well, supposing the bodies have disintegrated by then, or that they were destroyed. What's going to happen there? So there's a bit of inconsistency there, and people are you're not being given the full picture here about what Paul actually believed. I'll accept that there's a physical element to this resurrection, but Paul is explicitly against the very same body being raised.
Okay. So the first thing I just want to address, it's true that Paul does make a contrast, right? And Mike Licona perfectly explains that, right, between the natural and the spiritual bodies. And we see this, right? Jesus' resurrected body is said to be the first fruits. It's glorious and it's spiritual in the sense it's been raised in the Holy Spirit and that sort of thing. That's the key difference. And that's why, we have spiritual wisdom, right? Where it's wisdom given to us by the Holy Spirit when we're in a right standing with God. Or the law is spiritual because that puts us, is inspired by the Holy Spirit, puts us in a right relationship with God from an Old Testament standpoint. And so that's the contrast that's being made there between spiritual and natural. And even you are admitting it's not between physical and bodily and like ghostly, instead of spiritual, ghostly, right? So you're admitting that now. And I would, in terms of, okay, but is it something totally different? Well, remember my first argument proves no, that to the ancient Jewish mindset, we can prove that this word shows bodily continuity. The ancient Jews all said yes. And Paul makes this explicit in his analogy of the seed. What goes down in the earth, that's your body. That's what comes back up again, transformed. It's still the same body. It's been transformed, right? Just like my body, it's my body that I had when I was 5 years old, but it's been transformed. It's got some changes from back then, right? So you would have to reckon with this continuity, which I think you're just kind of denying.
Yes, I am, Dale. Even common sense tells us that if someone is burnt, for instance, the body's burnt, there's ashes. There's what do you think the Jewish belief was, that somehow all those ashes from all over the bottom of the sea and the riverbed and the earth was somehow all come together and reform into a body? Is that what they believed? Is that what Paul believes?
So right. So here's the third point that you raised, right? So you're saying if mine is correct, then this leads to a logical problem. It's what I call Dale Allison's doubts, right? So let me kind of respond to that. I have some slides and I have a clip. So I want to respond to that objection because I don't think this posits a factual or metaphysical objection to the notion of continuity. So let me just show you, and it's just one slide, so it won't be too long, but there are many responses to Dale Allison's doubts here, right? So the response number one, continuity or identity can be is preserved through bodily transformation, regardless of our individual molecules. So the first question is, why do you need to assume, like some ancient Jew in the first century who didn't understand science, why do you assume this all or nothing dilemma whereby God can't resurrect unique molecules ex nihilo or something, right? Like maybe it's the same, all of the same molecules on the day of judgment. God just pops up. Okay, I've got all of the same molecules that I had before that made me up, even though they didn't endure through all of time. So that's one response to this annihilation question that Dale Allison brings, that, let's say I'm in a fire or I'm in a bomb and all my atoms are totally obliterated and then incorporated into worms and blah, 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 right? The second response is that this is from Dr. William Lane Craig. Human identity need not be preserved via connection to our physical bodies at all for there to be a bodily resurrection. All that matters is that the same soul becomes embodied within created matter to form a human being. So let me just play Dr. William Lane Craig's clip here. So it's the soul that's providing continuity there. And after I play that, I'll explain why. Well, then doesn't that deny bodily continuity? No, and I'll explain.
The question about the resurrection body as it might relate to dualists.
Yes.
The resurrection, I think, ontology has always tripped me up. My question is, does a Christian, be he a dualist or a materialist, need to affirm a physical continuity between the crucified corpse of Jesus and the resurrection body of Jesus? Or is there room in orthodoxy for physical discontinuity?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that it's heretical, but I do think that when you examine what Paul teaches about the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15, it's very clear that he thinks that the resurrection body is a transformation of the earthly body so that there is historical continuity. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 and following, he says, "It is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." And then he goes on to say in verse 53, "For this perishable must put on the imperishable, this mortal must put on immortality. When this perishable shall have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory." So the verbs and the pronouns that Paul is using there have reference to the earthly body, which is transformed into this powerful spiritual resurrection body. So I think that it's pretty convincing that Paul teaches and believes in the historical continuity of the earthly body with the resurrection body, insofar as there are any remains, as there were in Jesus' case, of course. Now, in the case of someone whose remains have been utterly vaporized and destroyed, the early rabbis dealt with questions like that, because belief in the resurrection is, of course, a Jewish belief as well. And what they said would be, in cases like that, God had the ability to create new material, ex nihilo, and that could be the stuff of the resurrection body. So that it is not as though the historical continuity from the earthly to the resurrection body is essential for the identity of the person who is raised. On the contrary, I would say that personal identity is ensured by precisely the soul, which goes through an intermediate disembodied condition that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 5 until it receives the new resurrection body. And if there are remains, say skeletal remains of the earthly body, I think Paul believes these will be the stuff out of which the resurrection body is made. But if there are no remains left, then new matter can be created. and it will nevertheless still be the person who is raised who died because of the continuity of the soul through the disembodied condition into a newly embodied state. So I think your dualism solves any problem there.
Okay, so just to summarize my answer, and then I'll come back to you. What I was trying to say here is that the Bible is clear about the general rule of resurrection in ensuring bodily continuity whenever possible. In the rare exceptions when that's not possible, because say you're in a bomb and all your atoms are vaporized and sent off to Timbuktu, the continuity of identity is preserved through the shroud, through the soul, and then God creates ex nihilo atoms that corresponded exactly to your body when you were alive. So these are exception cases, and exception cases don't disprove the general rule, let alone what Jesus, whereby his atoms weren't vaporized or anything like that. And indeed, decomposition, we can prove from the shroud there was not even any decomposition liquids that formed sufficiently on the shroud. So bodily continuity is the general rule. That doesn't deny that there can be exceptions. But even with exceptions, the continuity of identity still follows through the soul.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no. Well, I'm agreeing with you there. I do believe that there is continuity of identity through the soul, and what I'm disagreeing with is that that there has to be some kind of bodily continuity as well, and I don't see the bodily continuity argument in Paul. Obviously, I can see it in William Lane Craig, but I don't see it in Paul.
Sorry. But he was citing Paul. Like when he was establishing the general rule, he cited, I think he cited the same analogy I did, whereby it's clear within the Jewish mindset, and it's not even just William Lane Craig. N.T. Wright, I've read his 700-page book. He looks at every single source from 200 BC to 200 AD. Not a single one posits that's just unheard of. Every single one posits bodily continuity as the general rule, whereby what dies, that's what raises, that's what awakes. It's the same physical body that goes down into the earth and then comes up on the day of judgment.
Yeah. Well, that might have been the Jewish belief, but I just don't see it here in Paul, as I said.
What is he saying then? If he's saying it, right? My third question to you, like it, and he's referring to our natural physical bodies that you admit that's what Paul's talking about. That goes down into the dirt, just like a seed, and then it again comes up. If what you're saying is true, then it would be my physical natural body goes down in the earth, and then my new body just pops onto the scene while my old one's still dead in the earth, and I start dancing around in my new body. That's not what Paul says. There's clearly continuity between what's going down in the earth. That's what pops up and does a little jig at the resurrection.
Well, Paul doesn't say that, does he? I mean, you talked about what is the it. The it could mean the person.
So you're saying the soul is what goes down into the earth and then comes up, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it will. You know, if it's. I'm not saying Paul is totally clear here, but there's a. He's talking about a sowing and then a raising, isn't it? Something being sown and then something being raised. But you've got there sowing a natural body, raising a spiritual body. It's contrasting the two, isn't he?
So no, he's not.
The natural body is contrasted with the spiritual body.
Well, let me just ask you then, because I won't be prepared to respond to it in this episode, but it depends on whether you believe in annihilationism or not. But to my mind, look, the clear Christian view of the afterlife is that no, our souls, upon dying and our bodies go into the dirt, our souls separate. They're not in the dirt. They're down in Hades, or in the New Testament period, either in heaven or down in Sheol, awaiting the day of judgment. And this is clearly Jewish and Paul's Pharisaic beliefs that we don't rise again until resurrection day. But the afterlife posits, no, our souls are up there doing a jig right now with Jesus in heaven already. So wouldn't Paul, if Paul's teaching what you said, he would say, well, the resurrection's already happened. The day of judgment's already happened because there are souls up there with Jesus right now. They're not in the dirt. So I don't think positing the it is the soul works at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, maybe. I'm not sure that Paul is really clear here about what he means by it. He's trying to make a polemical point, isn't it? And the point is against those who are saying it's just going to be the same body that's raised. That's his point. Is arguing against that. He's contrasting natural and spiritual, isn't he? And he's saying, no, it's not going to be the natural body. In other words, it's not going to be the same body. It's going to be a different body.
He says it's not going to be a different body, right? It's going to be a different nature of the body is what I'm trying to bring it up. Okay, my thing's frozen. Okay. But
I'm just wondering if we sidetracked ourselves here, because we've been going an hour and we've been spending quite a long time on 1 Corinthians 15 and what Paul actually believed. But I think your main argument here on the empty tomb is that, as you said to me and now and previously, is that a belief in bodily resurrection implies an empty tomb.
Yeah, it's impossible for there to be a belief in bodily resurrection without an empty tomb. Yeah. So
if we can just get away from the details of what Paul actually believed, and remember that Paul was not a witness, even though was not a claimed witness to the bodily resurrection.
Can I just one last question? Then I promise we will move on. But would you admit that Mike Lacona's argument about the contrast in 1 Corinthians about the nature of this bodily thing could be interpreted as spiritual in the sense that he was talking about, in terms of being spiritually minded, being raised in the Holy Spirit, as opposed to being raised,
It could mean that, yes. I don't think that Paul or any other writer necessarily uses words like spiritual and fleshly in the same sense in every occurrence that he uses. I read an article in the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. This is the one on flesh and spirit, I think, and the writer tots up 6 different uses of flesh in Paul, to contrast flesh and spirit. So, just going over, just collecting together all the cases where Paul uses the words, I don't think we can assume that Paul is using these univocally. I think we just need to look at the actual passage to try and get his meaning.
Okay, and
but we've gone back to Paul again, haven't we?
No, I was just asking, right?
And
Paul and the early disciples, because they're linked there, as I said. But the second question is on the empty tomb then. So would you also admit that if I can establish to you that Paul is talking about the bodily resurrection, do you then think that N.T. Wright's argument would work, that means there must have been an empty tomb for them to believe in the bodily resurrection?
Well, I mean, I don't see why we're talking about Paul now. If we're on to N.T. Wright, let's see.
No. Paul is
N.T. Wright's arguments. Yeah. N.T. Wright demonstrates. This is your slide. Demonstrates conclusively that belief in a bodily resurrection of Jesus and the resultant 14 facts could not have occurred unless the early apostles believed that Jesus had appeared to them and that the tomb was empty. Yeah. He shows that positing the resurrection appearances alone, while the body still lay in a known tomb or common pit, could not have produced belief in a bodily resurrection of Jesus.
Correct.
Instead, they would have disbelieved or believed in some kind of spiritual ascension alone for Jesus. All right, so I haven't read the book, and you have the advantage on me, 700 pages of advantage there. But I don't see it. And I know I should have read the book before coming on today, but But the
Yeah, I wish I could. I tried searching around for like a shorter source, but I couldn't find it. But I'll search again. If there's something I can send you, I will.
yeah,
But
I mean, the alternative, alternative naturalistic idea, as I was saying to you, is that there may be two or three grief hallucinations, if you like, of beliefs in Jesus appeared, or he may have actually really appeared. And I don't disbelieve that. I do believe that people can appear to loved ones after death, non-physically, and spiritually. Spiritually in the sense of non-fleshly, and that could have happened, and then from that arose a belief in a bodily resurrection, that Jesus' flesh, ate and was touched and so on, and that could have started circulating quite early on, and so I think it's quite credible that within a few years these stories were going around. And I'm not saying the gospel writers made things up. I think the gospel writers wrote down, mostly from the stories that were going around and were accepted in the circle of believers. Although I think they did invent some stuff, but I think the writer of Mark was writing what he didn't make things up there. He got it from what the general belief was, and so it could have been quite early. But it doesn't take long for kind of false beliefs to be added onto a kernel of fact, if you like, and there have been studies that show this, that people can add in, even people can remember things or claim to remember things that never actually happened, and I've experienced this in my own life as well. Is that memory is a peculiar thing, and we can persuade ourselves to believe that we remember something when it didn't actually happen, or we're not sure. And in an age without newspapers, electronic communications, internet, geographical separation, it's quite possible that believers in, say, Antioch would be believing stuff that that if you cross-examined people in Jerusalem who were still high witnesses, they would have said no, that didn't happen. But these stories grow up without any fabrication, conscious fabrication. So even as early as a few years afterwards, there could have been this belief in a burial in a tomb, could have grown up. And I asked myself, what's more likely? And I'm allowing, even allowing an appearance. Appearance like to Paul. I believe people can appear after death. I'm not a naturalist like that. But it's the bodily, it's actually a miracle side of it, the bodily resurrection, that I'm skeptical about.
Okay.
Again, I'm asking, on Hume's question, I'm looking at Hume's, maxim, if you like. Which is more likely? Which is more likely, that we had a miracle, or that the evidence is that the testimony is somehow false or misleading, or something like that?
Well, that's irrelevant. That's more at the level of explanation, I say. And right now, we're just establishing the historical facts of the empty tomb, right? So I don't need to posit a miracle. Maybe someone stole a body. We can go with. We're not trying to explain this. I'm just trying to get you to a point where the empty tomb is a fact, if that's possible. And
yes. Well, I would agree with you. If we get to, if one accepts that there was a tomb and it was empty, then we're a long way there towards a bodily resurrection.
So let
then we're looking at tomb robbers, alternative explanations, tomb robbers, or somebody stealing the body, or
for this show,
tomb being found, or
for this show, I don't
like
care. I'll grant you skeptics whatever you want. Okay, they hallucinated and someone stole the body. It doesn't matter. We'll debate that in a future show when we get to the level of explanations. But I think if I'm listening to you, my best hope, I think something that's kind of pricked you is this N.T. Wright's argument. If I'm going to convince you of the empty tomb, if I'm understanding, the N.T. Wright argument is the one that you find most promising. And what's holding you back is, okay, we've been debating for a long time that they believed in a bodily resurrection. So I'm going to look for sources to prove that, because I think that is very, very probably true. It's the evidence is proven beyond all reasonable doubt. So I'm going to try to provide some sources and see what you think on that. But what I find also surprising to me is that, look, you're like, even if you get me to believe in the bodily resurrection, you don't think N.T. Wright's argument works. You think they could believe in a bodily resurrection, even if they saw the body in the tomb and said, oh, who cares? Yeah, he bodily rose. But they even though they don't have an empty tomb. And that is a little bit surprising to me. So I think how I would...
I didn't say that, Dale. I didn't say that, did I?
I thought you did. I thought I heard that, but okay. So you,
No.
okay.
No,
So
no. I agree. I agree with you. Bodily resurrection goes with an empty tomb. If there was a tomb, yes.
Okay. So that's great. So it's just a matter of, so one thing I want to show you that's new, and I want to get your take on, because it's not as simple as just getting belief in a bodily resurrection. N.T. Wright also points to several mutations. This is the criterion of dissimilarity for historicity. And, you keep saying, well, it's simple to just make up this myth about a bodily empty tomb and a bodily resurrection. I don't think it's as simple as you seem to be saying here. And there are a total of 14 things that you have to explain if this is a quote unquote myth or a very early lie or story or whatever you want to call it. So the first are Wright's 7 mutations, right? So number 1, you have to explain how Christian theology of the afterlife totally mutates from multiple views under Judaism, right? And under the standard Pharisaic view, you have Sheol, where both good and bad are down there together, to this new single view of, okay, the good people go to be with Christ in heaven. The bad people are still down in Sheol, waiting the day of judgment. And then we will all be bodily risen from the dead at that time. Secondly, you have to explain why all of a sudden the centrality of the doctrine of the resurrection. Within Judaism, it was there in Daniel, arguably, but it was peripheral at best. It was just kind of, we're going to be raised and judged on the last day. But the resurrection becomes absolutely essential and central to the religion itself. Thirdly, the idea of what the resurrection would be like goes from multiple views under Judaism to a single view, right? This incorruptible, spiritually oriented body composed of the material for the previous corruptible body. The timing of the resurrection changes. So from a single resurrection day where everyone is resurrected at the same time, now we have this split where the Messiah is risen individually as the first fruits in 30 AD, and everyone else will be risen at the end of time. Fifthly, there's a new view of eschatology as a collaboration with God to transform the world. There's a new metaphorical concept of resurrection, which represents being born again. That's totally absent in Judaism of the Old Testament. And there's finally a new association of the concept of resurrection, specifically with the role of the Jewish Messiah. So these are the first 7 mutations. Do you want to go over that, or do you want me to show the 7 historical puzzles?
No. I could. Obviously, there's a lot of scholarship that's gone into that, but we're looking at their what Wright, at a distance of 2,000 years, what Christian doctrine has, as it were, arrived at, and but we don't know at the time were all these multiple competing views. All we have is the evidence of the New Testament, and which is what survived. We don't know how many alternative views there were around at the time that got kind of that did not survive, did not make the cut, if you like. That there were, as you know, many other Gospels and Acts books that were floating around, and but were discarded around about the 200 AD, and we arrived at by some process of elimination at the New Testament that we have. So we're looking backwards, really. These are arguments looking backwards on the basis of what eventually survived, made the cut, if you like. But the main point here is the one that Paul Auger makes, I think, very well, is that bodily resurrection is indistinguishable in consequences from a firm belief in bodily resurrection. The two are indistinguishable in terms of the events that follow.
Okay. Okay. So just for right now, I think you're kind of conceding that it wasn't really just as simple as just, okay, let's just make up the myth of a bodily resurrection. That clearly from the pages of the New Testament, this is all established from the New Testament, right? So we're not talking centuries. This is within the first centuries. By the time the Gospels have been written, these mutations are all definitely in place. And that, I would say, that's not enough time. Even if I grant you like 4 or 5 decades or 6 decades in the case of the Gospel of John or something like that, that isn't enough time for a complete overhaul of the former religion in these remarkable ways. Like, this is not something there's no other comparable thing where we have this complete overhaul from a myth and stuff. We can see the development of myth taking centuries with bit by bit and stuff like that. So it just doesn't fit. What you're calling myth doesn't fit and can't explain all of these mutations by just positing that 3 years after or 40 years after, whenever you're saying that someone just went like, oh, okay, I'm going to make up the bodily resurrection to kind of compete with the proto-Gnostics. If I heard you correctly, I think you're saying Gnostics were around in the...
Yeah, there were lots of other views flying around, weren't there? We've got a good idea of
well, there's no evidence of that. I mean, the Gnostics don't come in until late first century at the earliest, from the evidence, right? Like, there's...
Oh, yes, but don't people get the idea that they were kind of proto-Gnostics, as you were saying, from looking at some of Paul's letters?
Yeah, and that's who I'm talking about in the late first century. The Gnostics proper don't show up till the second century.
Oh yeah. Well, what you call proper or not, is a matter of definition, isn't it? But I'm just saying that in some of, I think is it Colossians, that people say that he's arguing partly against Gnostic type views. But anyway, we're going off the subject here.
Okay, but I'm just curious. One question for you.
Yes, I stick by what I said. Is that a firm belief in the bodily resurrection amongst a group of disciples in Jerusalem, and say 3 years after Jesus died, is indistinguishable from a bodily resurrection having happened. And all you need to kick off the church, what you had is some people firmly believing that Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Right, and that's where we would get into explaining how they could get those beliefs and stuff. And that's where I would say, like, the only way is if it was true, if there actually was an empty tomb and they believe. We're not getting to the bodily resurrection yet. In terms of proving that is a hypothesis that's true. That's at the explanatory level. But if you're granting me that there was this belief in a bodily resurrection, that entails that they had to believe in an empty tomb. And if they had a belief in an empty tomb as of 3 years after Jesus, that entails that there had to actually be an empty tomb, because you can't explain how they would get a belief in an empty tomb or a bodily resurrection unless there actually was one.
Oh, yeah. I think we've got the logic around the wrong way a bit here, Dale. I'm saying that certainly if there was a tomb, then you'd expect that the disciples would associate bodily resurrection with an empty tomb, if there were a tomb. But if the naturalistic hypothesis that that people put forward is not an empty tomb, but that Jesus appeared, and then the story and the story grew up. The belief amongst them that he had to beat a fish, and I touched his side, and these kind of stories could have grown up to such an extent that even if you cross-examine Thomas, a few years later, he firmly believed that that's what happened, even though it didn't, without any reference to tomb.
Sure.
And later in the story of the empty tomb, and so on, could have come in. And all the stuff being added in to stories to, if you like, counter arguments that from skeptics that no, Jesus, especially from the Jews, saying no, Jesus wasn't raised bodily. Well, then story about the eating fish, in the later chapter of John, which I believe was written, the last chapter of John was written apparently much later, where again trying to counter possibly that this. That Jesus wasn't raised bodily because he ate fish, and so on. So these could all have grown up without an empty tomb. An empty tomb could have snuck in there as part of the the ballast of the story. I don't think
you're
it happened at
misunderstanding.
the beginning.
But I think you're misunderstanding the argument. I don't care about any of those details about eating fish and Thomas and all that stuff. But I'm saying that there was this belief in bodily resurrection 3 years after. You're conceding that you've agreed to that you think there was a group.
Yes.
Now, if that's true, that entails they also taught all 7 of these, because these are logical derivations from belief. If you believe then there's an actual bodily resurrection within first century Jewish context, that entails these 7 mutations were also believed 3 years after Jesus died. And there's also 7 historical puzzles that I'm going to come to, but I wanted to ask you before I forget. So great, you've pointed to, you think there are also these proto-Gnostics, and these proto-Gnostics are here at 3 years afterwards, and in fact they're the original disciples in Jerusalem, to which 3 years later the physicalists are reacting. I just want to ask you, for fairness, when you're evaluating, take this in, do you have any evidence or proof that this proto-Gnostic group actually existed 3 years after Jesus' death?
Oh no, Dale, it was just a speculation. No, don't put any weight on that at all.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm just saying that from what I've read, there were all kinds of views floating around, and being argued, but we know that actually that the Jerusalem church fades from history, and it's Gentile Christianity that survives, doesn't it? And it's Gentile Christianity that makes that decides what books make the cut, into what they're going to call the New Testament.
Okay, but again, that doesn't matter, right? Because you're talking about centuries later. Who cares? We have the New Testament. That's first century, while the Christian church is still Jewish, heavily Jewish focused.
Oh yeah, I know, but also there are lots of other books as well that were discarded.
Okay, not in the first century.
Well,
do you have any proof?
We don't know. I mean, we don't know, do we?
Okay, but that's all. I'm just trying to say.
Books that never were copied.
David,
all we've got is what survives, obviously.
The point that I'm just trying to get, because I am trying to make progress, right? I don't want to just an academic discussion with you, although that's fine. But I want to see if progress is possible. That's why I'm pushing. And if you don't like it, I'll stop. But so I just want to clarify for you in the audience, we do have evidence that the physicalist resurrection people existed 3 years, and we're teaching this at least at the latest 3 years after Jesus' death. We don't have any evidence that these proto-Gnostics existed 3 years after Jesus' death, and we're teaching a spiritual resurrection. It's just pure supposition based on later, like in 50 AD, in a pagan context when Paul is having to deal with heretics and stuff like that. That's all we have. The evidence just shows that there were people who disagreed decades later. We don't have any evidence that there was anyone disagreeing and teaching a spiritual resurrection 3 years after the resurrection.
No, I agree, but okay. So what? I mean, it doesn't. entitle us to say that there weren't any people believing that. And I will concede, Dale, exactly what you said, that 3 to 4 to 5, 6 years people were believing in a bodily resurrection. And a story with a tomb, yes, that would have got attached at that time, perhaps. So, but again, all I'm saying is that a firm belief there does not imply truth.
Okay, agreed. So, okay, so here's my argument. This is where I'm trying to lead it to then. So let's try to explain the origins of that belief under your hypothesis. I don't see how it could arise, right? Because you have the originals teaching this spiritual Gnostic resurrection of Jesus, right? They are the authorities. Even the physicalists admit, yes, that Peter, the original Jerusalem disciples, these guys are the ones who define our doctrines. We have to listen to them. They are the eyewitnesses and stuff. So why would they contradict? I mean, this is just 3 years after. So Peter's still around. They have easy access to all these original disciples. Why would they just contradict Peter and the authorities on the spiritual resurrection? I just can't see why that would come about so early on.
I don't know really what you're talking about here, Dale. I did not claim that there were Christians believing in only a spiritual resurrection 3 years afterwards. I never said that.
Okay, what is the difference then? Like, I thought you claimed that you believe Jesus. There are proto-Gnostics. What do they teach? It
was a speculation. Don't place any weight on it. All I was trying to say is that there are doubtless a lot of views floating around, and we only know what survived into what was written down, what survived and was not thrown away. We don't know what other views might have been there.
But
we do know that the Jewish church died out, and after AD 70, we don't hear any more about that. And what survived is Gentile Christianity, and what the Gentile church in around about 200 decided would make the cut into the New Testament.
Well, that was you're talking about in the mid-2nd century after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. There is a predominance, right? The Jewish church never died out; it's always been there, but predominantly it was the Gentile church. But that has nothing to do with the New Testament. That was written in the 1st century when Jewish Christianity was predominant, and that's what we're using to judge the early beliefs. I don't care.
Yes, but all I'm saying, Dale, I'm not trying to make a big thing about it, but there were a lot of other books written as well which maybe didn't make it. Well, maybe written in the 1st century, but didn't make it.
Okay, so
I mean, whether or not there were other beliefs which may not have been written down into Gospels, for all we know.
Okay, so
but we have heard, the story of the Jewish believers, and I forget what they're called now, the poor people or something like that. Isn't that right? The what's the name for it? The Jewish Christian, specifically.
The Ebionites.
That's right. The Ebionites, yeah.
They're around in 90 AD. Like, we know their origins came after the destruction of the second.
Yeah, so they didn't make it into the church. Their beliefs have died out. We don't have an Ebionite gospel. There might have been one.
Okay, but all of these.
Are we getting off the point here? I mean, well, time is running out, isn't it? So.
If you think that's off.
Yeah, I mean, I said to you that a firm belief in something does not imply that something is true, actually happened. And I'm saying that about the disciples. I'm saying perhaps Peter and some women really believed that they saw Jesus, and there may well have been an appearance. And over time, the way that memory works and the way that we transmit our beliefs to others in a group of like-minded people, that all the group of disciples really believed that Jesus appeared on that day, and that over a fairly short time there could well have been the belief that Jesus was eating fish and being touched and all of that, and Peter would, if you'd asked Peter, he would have said, yeah, Jesus really appeared. I said earlier that memories are really funny thing, a peculiar thing. It's not like a video camera. And there have been studies that show, Bart Ehrman talks about this in one of his debates, doesn't he? That people in studies, yes, too, have been really convinced that, where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated or something like that, something more recent. And people firmly believe something that could not have been the case, that they were there when it happened, when in fact they were somewhere else. Okay. And these are people in where we've got all this technology available to supplement our memory, but yet we can find ourselves believing that such and such happened a few years ago when it didn't. Okay, it's not a case of lying or deceiving. It's, I think, genuine belief there. But okay. There's not enough. Just because people really believed that it happened doesn't mean that it did.
Yes, it does. Okay, yes, it does. In some cases, yes, it does. That's the argument that I was trying to get to with you. Right? That's why what I was showing you before was relevant when you said we're getting off topic, because I'm saying it 3 years after the fact is so early, and it originates in Jerusalem. We know the First Corinthian Creed originates from Jerusalem because that's where Paul got his information from for these traditions. So I'm saying that in that particular case, it's so early and there's such easy access to the authorities giving a contrary tradition, whatever that tradition is. It's not the physical traditional bodily resurrection belief, that the creed is responding to. I'm saying that in that context, the physical bodily resurrection belief could never have taken ground. It would have been immediately contradicted. And then they would have said, okay, yes, you're right. We're going to go back to the proto-Gnostics or the non-physical resurrection belief, whatever you think that could entail. The alternate, let's call it the alternate view. And I don't think that there were dozens of alternate views so early on. That's not how legends work. I mean, at most you'd have maybe one or two or something, right? Within such an early period. So that was the argument that I was trying to get to, that would convince you that, look, at such an early period, no, we don't have all these alternate traditions. And in fact, any alternate traditions that would deviate from the authorities in the place where they would have been immediately contradicted and therefore couldn't have survived until a later period.
Well, I don't think you heard what I said, Dale, with respect, which is that I think the naturalistic hypothesis here, as put forward by Paul Ogier and others, is that there was firm belief there amongst the disciples that there was a bodily appearance of Jesus.
So the problem, okay, in what way is the First Corinthians Creed alternate then? Because I'm not understanding in what way is it alternate if it's...
No, I mean, the First Corinthians would be, creed would be consistent with that. Burial, resurrection.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is that a firm belief in X, whatever X is, that Trump won the last election does not imply that Trump won the last election. And there are a lot of people that believe that he did.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, that's my bad, actually. Yeah. So, okay. So here's the other argument that I should have raised. So sorry. Yeah. Forget about the competing. Okay. So great. So they have this belief. In order to explain the belief, that would require an empty tomb. Like how on earth could they come to a belief in an empty tomb when they would have been in the position to actually go and check the tomb and say, oh no, the body's still there. There's no way they could come to that belief when the false...
Yes, okay, Dale. Well, as I said, you're assuming that there was a tomb.
Well, I argued for it last time, right? So
I know, man, but I'm on record as being skeptical about the tomb. Yes.
Okay, so how did these people 3 years afterwards, right, that would have been alive in 30 AD, why would they start teaching that there was a tomb if there never was a tomb? They wouldn't do that. They would know, oh, that's falsified. We're lying, and we can't. That's against our rules. We can't lie. So how could they be deluded into going, there was a tomb 3 years after the event? Like, our memory, I've seen the memory studies. It's not that bad. It's not like, oh, we would make something up whole cloth and say, yeah, I saw the tomb when there wasn't even a tomb. Like what you're talking about with contradictions. Yeah, there's contradictions. Did the Titanic break in half or did it sink full down? But nobody just made up the Titanic. As no, there was a ship and it sank, and that's kind of the baseline for that belief that they had. So what you're saying, they made up an empty tomb without even an empty tomb ever being present.
Well, again, Dale, first thing, memory is a really funny, peculiar thing. It's a peculiar thing. We can sincerely believe something happened that didn't happen. Secondly, we don't actually see, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see in the speeches in Acts mention of an empty tomb. Paul does not mention an empty tomb, as I said before. I know we've got this creed, but buried and raised. So looks like, there's a tomb implied there, but it's not explicitly there. The story about a tomb could well have grown up, and Peter may not have, remembered it that way, but we don't know what Peter said to Paul. We don't know what exactly the firm belief was. If you went back in a time machine in, say, 40 AD or 50 AD and asked Peter what actually happened on that day, then that would be one thing. That would be, we'd get his memory. But we don't. The stories get floating around and people add to them, and there's the geographical separation, and it's not really easy, to go. You've got Peter there sitting in Jerusalem, and the other disciples gone who knows where, and then you've got Christians over in Asia Minor, and they're not going to go down to Jerusalem to check the story. They're going to, if they're believers, they're going to accept what they're told.
Okay, so I'm going to let you have the last word on that. I just will suggest, like, when it comes to memory, please check out the work of Richard Bauckham, who actually cites peer-reviewed secular studies of memory. It's not as willy-nilly as you seem to think, or as Bart Ehrman argued there. That's my only suggestion. But David Russell, are you here? I see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Nope, we're not hearing you. Video's off. All right, well, we are at an hour and a half anyways, so okay, fair enough. We can hear you now. Hey, David.
I'm sorry, I'm having so many issues this morning. So what was the question, Dale, on this particular topic? Hey, David, it's been a while, buddy.
Hi.
Sorry, man, I've been having some real bad issues lately, so sorry for being late, guys.
No problem. So I'm going to ask, out of respect for David KC's time, I'm going to ask, we do have David here. Do you want to spend the next 20 minutes talking with him about his argument, or do you want to end now and then reschedule to talk with him about his argument from the general reliability of the documents?
For me, I'd like to reschedule, please. You say schedule, I say schedule. But I think it would be good if we get David in from the beginning, and the statement that David made that we can establish a miracle from ancient documents is a challenging one, and so we'd like to see, I think, some more flesh on the bones there. But yeah, Dale, I think we've made some progress here. I think logically we have, and in conclusion, I'm really saying that a firm belief in an empty tomb, bodily resurrection, could be floating around and in the disciples' circles for a few years afterwards, just through a memory and wanting to believe, and possibly spiritual appearances of Jesus to a few people, and from that kind of seed. Views details can accrete until we get this tomb story, Jesus eating and so on. But and just because people firmly believe something is not true. But then you made a good point at the end here, is that how would they believe it if there was no empty tomb? So if we have another show, we could pick up there as well.
Sure, yeah,
and
and I'll
also
read
talk about
Richard.
David Russell's view, which is worthy of a good go, I think. And I'm flagging a bit now, especially as my tooth extraction is taking its toll on my concentration.
Sounds good. Okay, cool. So we will end here. I just want to say thank you to Ringo Cat, who's in the audience and been giving great feedback and stuff like that. So thank you for David for showing up at the very last minute, but you will be on next time.
I will. I'm sorry.
No problem. And thank you to David Kemball-Cook for giving this back and forth and putting up with me. I'm usually a lot more softball and passive, but with you, I have an agenda. I am trying to actually persuade you and stuff like that. So I hope that's cool with you. But yeah,
I appreciate it, Dale. It's good. Iron sharpens iron, and I really appreciate these conversations with you. Awesome. They can get a bit feisty at times, but that's all good. Awesome. We're all on the same team here. We're
absolutely.
I'm a real seeker like you.
Cool. Yep, that's what I'm here for, right? So, all right, guys. Well, take care. And next Saturday, tune in because I have Jack Markwart returning at 11 a.m. to talk about the historicity of the shroud. And specifically, he told me we were going to cover originally 901 to 1204 AD, but there's just so many documents and evidence involved in the 10th century from 901 to 1000 AD that we're just going to spend the entire 3-hour show on that one century alone. There's that much evidence. So tune in next week and take care, Ringo, and everyone else in the audience. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye then.